Tonight, we are going somewhere that no longer exists. Or rather, somewhere that exists only in fragments. In stones pulled from jungle floors. In pottery shards that survived when everything else crumbled. In words carved into walls by hands that have been dust for 1,000 years. Lost civilizations. The word lost is interesting. These places were not misplaced. They did not wander off. They rose, sometimes over centuries, sometimes with extraordinary speed, built cities, wrote laws, mapped the stars, created art of breathtaking beauty, and then stopped. Fell silent. Were swallowed by desert or jungle or sea or time itself. And we are left with the pieces. A stone calendar so accurate it tracked celestial events we only recently confirmed. A city of 2,000 years ago with indoor plumbing more sophisticated than what existed in Europe a century ago. Writing systems we still cannot read. Monuments so large and so precisely built that engineers today study them to understand techniques we have not yet fully replicated. The people who built these things were not mysteries to themselves. They knew exactly who they were. They had names for their cities, their gods, their kings. They had stories, jokes, recipes, love letters, arguments about money and politics and the proper way to perform a funeral. All of that is gone. What remains are the bones of what they built, and the questions those bones ask us. Tonight we will visit 11 lost worlds. We will walk their streets, sit in their temples, read what remains of their words. We will ask what happened to them, and in some cases, we will find that the answer is stranger than any myth. Get comfortable. Close your eyes if you'd like. Let the past come to you. The term lost civilization is something of a misnomer. Most civilizations we call lost were not unknown to the people living near them. Local communities often knew exactly where the ruins were, they had lived alongside them for generations, incorporated them into their own stories and spiritual practices, sometimes built their own homes from the stones of the fallen cities. What was lost was the knowledge held by outsiders. European explorers arriving in the Americas or Southeast Asia or the Sahara encountered ruins that local people could name and describe, and declared them discovered, erasing a continuity of memory that had never actually broken. When we say a civilization is lost, we usually mean lost to us. Lost to the written record of a particular tradition. Lost to the museums and universities that decide what counts as known. The stones themselves were never lost. They were always there, in the jungle, in the sand, under the water. Waiting. The oldest known civilization on Earth is not in Egypt or Mesopotamia. It is in Peru. The Caral civilization flourished in the Sup Valley of Peru around 3000 BC, making it contemporary with the earliest Egyptian dynasties and the cities of ancient Sumer. For most of the 20th century, it was unknown to mainstream archaeology. Caral was a city of pyramids, plazas, and amphitheaters. It had no walls, no evidence of warfare at all. No weapons. No images of conquest. It appears to have been a civilization that thrived for 1,000 years without war. When archaeologists excavated it in the 1990s and early 2000s, they found quipus, knotted string recording devices, that may represent one of the world's earliest writing systems. A city of peace, buried under sand in the Peruvian desert, that rewrote everything we thought we knew about where civilization began. The Indus Valley civilization was the largest of the ancient world, and we still cannot read its writing. At its height around 2500 BCE, the Indus Valley civilization covered an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. It stretched across what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, encompassing over 1,000 settlements. Its two great cities, Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, were marvels of urban planning. Streets laid out on a precise grid. Buildings constructed with standardized bricks, the same ratio of dimensions used to cross the entire civilization regardless of location. A sewage system more sophisticated than anything that existed in Europe until the 19th century. Every house had access to clean water and drainage. Rubbish collection was built into the city's infrastructure. Public baths suggest an elaborate system of ritual cleanliness. And then, around 1900 BCE, it began to fade. Cities were abandoned gradually. The population dispersed. Within a few centuries, the great cities were empty. We do not know why. We cannot ask, because we cannot read their writing. Over 4,000 Indus script inscriptions have been found, and not one has been deciphered. The largest civilization of the ancient world left us its cities but not its words. Mohenjo-daro means Mound of the Dead in Sindhi. This is the name given to it by the people living near it when archaeologists arrived, not the city's original name, which is unknown. The original inhabitants called it something. We do not know what. When archaeologists excavated Mohenjo-daro in the 1920s, they found something deeply puzzling in the upper levels of the city: skeletons lying in the streets, some holding hands, in positions suggesting they had died suddenly and been left unburied. For decades, this was cited as evidence of a violent end, massacre, invasion, catastrophe. More recent analysis has complicated this picture. The skeletons come from different periods, not a single event. Some may have been burial deposits rather than sudden deaths. The massacre interpretation may have been shaped more by the excavators' expectations than by the evidence itself. The dead of Mohenjo-daro remain difficult to read. Like everything else about this civilization, they keep their secrets. The ancient Egyptians knew about a civilization older than their own and called it the time before. Egyptian records refer to a period called Zep Tepi, the first time, a golden age before the historical dynasties, when gods walked the earth and civilization was perfect and complete. For most of modern history, this was understood as pure mythology, the kind of origin story every culture tells itself. But the Sphinx at Giza may complicate this. Geologist Robert Schoch, examining the erosion patterns on the Sphinx enclosure in the 1990s, argued that the deep vertical erosion on its walls was caused by heavy rainfall, and the last time that region received that kind of rainfall was between 700 and 1500 BCE, thousands of years before the accepted date of the Sphinx's construction. If Schoch is right, the Sphinx is far older than we think. And the Egyptians may have been building on foundations laid by a civilization we have not yet found. This remains deeply controversial. Most Egyptologists reject it. But the erosion is real. And the question it asks has not been fully answered. Plato described a civilization called Atlantis in two dialogues written around 360 BCE. He said it was a great naval power located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar. He said it had existed 9,000 years before his own time. He said it had sunk beneath the ocean in a single day and night of catastrophe. Scholars have debated ever since whether Atlantis was a real place, a philosophical allegory, or a distorted memory of an actual catastrophic event. The most compelling real-world candidate is the Minoan civilization on the island of Thera, modern Santorini, which was destroyed by one of the largest volcanic eruptions in human history around 1600 BCE. The eruption collapsed the center of the island into the sea. It generated tsunamis that devastated coastal settlements across the eastern Mediterranean. The Minoans were a sophisticated maritime civilization. Their destruction was catastrophic and sudden. Plato wrote about Atlantis 900 years after the Thera eruption. Memories distort over 9 centuries. Perhaps Atlantis is what a Greek philosopher remembered, at 900 years' distance, of a civilization that really did disappear beneath the sea. The Minoans of Crete were the first advanced civilization in Europe. From roughly 2700 to 1450 BCE, Minoan civilization dominated the Aegean. Their palace at Knossos was a labyrinthine complex of over 1,000 rooms, the origin, almost certainly, of the Greek myth of the labyrinth and the Minotaur. The Minoans had running water, flush toilets, and drainage systems. Their art, vivid frescoes of dolphins, bull leapers, and elegantly dressed women, shows a society of extraordinary sophistication and apparent joy. Unlike most ancient civilizations, their art almost never depicts warfare or conquest. Their writing, called Linear A, has never been deciphered. We know what sounds some symbols represent because a later script, Linear B, was clearly derived from it and has been read. But Linear A itself remains locked. We can almost hear the Minoans speaking. We cannot quite make out the words. Around 1450 BCE, Minoan civilization collapsed, probably a combination of the Thera eruption, tsunamis, and subsequent invasion by Mycenaean Greeks. The palaces burned. The frescoes were buried. Knossos lay hidden until the British archaeologist Arthur Evans excavated it beginning in 1900. He spent the rest of his life there, reconstructing what he found, sometimes, critics argue, reconstructing what he imagined rather than what existed. Even our picture of the Minoans may be partly Evans's invention. The Maya never disappeared. This is perhaps the most important correction in the study of lost civilizations. The Maya are not lost. Approximately 7 million Maya people live today across Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. Many still speak Mayan languages. Many maintain cultural practices with roots in the ancient civilization. What collapsed, between roughly 800 and 1000 CE, was the classic Maya civilization, the network of city-states, monumental architecture, sophisticated writing, and complex political systems that had flourished for centuries. The collapse was real and dramatic. Major cities were abandoned. Population declined catastrophically. Some estimates suggest a loss of 50 to 90% of the population in some areas. The long count calendar stopped being maintained. Monumental construction ceased. The causes were multiple and interacting: prolonged drought, political fragmentation, warfare between city-states, environmental degradation from intensive agriculture. But the people remained. Adapted. Survived. When we say the Maya collapsed, we mean a particular form of political and cultural organization ended. The people who built it did not vanish. Their descendants are alive today. The Maya long count calendar does not predict the end of the world. In 2012, widespread popular belief held that the Maya had predicted an apocalypse on December 21, the end of the Maya long count calendar's 13th Bakhtin cycle. Maya scholars found this baffling. The long count calendar is a cyclical system. The end of one cycle is the beginning of the next, like an odometer rolling over from 99,999 to 00000. No Maya text describes the end of the 13th Bakhtin as an apocalypse. Several Maya inscriptions actually reference dates far beyond 2012, suggesting the Maya expected time to continue indefinitely. The 2012 apocalypse was not a Maya prophecy. It was a modern invention, projected onto an ancient calendar by people who misunderstood how it worked. The Maya had genuine and sophisticated astronomical knowledge. They tracked the movements of Venus with extraordinary precision, predicted solar eclipses, and maintained multiple interlocking calendar systems of remarkable complexity. None of this knowledge predicted the world's end. It predicted the movements of stars. The ancient Maya city of Tikal was hidden in the jungle for centuries. Tikal, in what is now northern Guatemala, was one of the largest cities of the classic Maya period, a metropolis of perhaps 90,000 people at its height, with pyramids that rose above the jungle canopy to heights of 70 meters. After its abandonment around 900 CE, the jungle reclaimed it. Trees grew through the plazas. Vines wrapped the temples. Within a century or two, the city was invisible from more than a few meters away, a series of hills that happened to be suspiciously symmetrical. Local Maya communities knew the ruins existed. Spanish colonizers heard rumors of stone cities in the jungle. Scientific documentation began only in 1848. Full excavation has continued for over a century and is still not complete. In 2018, archaeologists using LiDAR laser scanning technology that penetrates jungle canopy revealed that Tikal was not a city. It was the center of an urban landscape covering over 2,000 square kilometers, connected by causeways, home to millions of people. Everything we thought we knew about the scale of Maya civilization was wrong. It was far larger than we imagined. The jungle hid not a city but a world. The Nazca lines in Peru can only be fully seen from the air. Across the Nazca Plateau in southern Peru, etched into the desert surface, are hundreds of enormous geoglyphs, geometric shapes, lines stretching for kilometers, and figures of animals and plants, a hummingbird, a spider, a monkey, a condor, a figure sometimes called the astronaut. The figures range in size up to 370 meters across. They were created by the Nazca people between roughly 500 BCE and 500 CE by removing the reddish surface stones to reveal the lighter ground beneath. They are only fully visible from altitude. This has generated centuries of speculation about their purpose. Alien landing strips. Messages to gods. Astronomical calendars. The most widely accepted current theory is that they were ritual pathways walked rather than viewed. The Nazca may have processed along the lines as a form of prayer or ceremony, the walking itself being the point rather than the viewing. But the question of why they made them so large enough to see from the sky, in a culture with no flight, remains genuinely open. Perhaps the gods were meant to see them. Perhaps the Nazca simply thought big. The city of Petra was carved entirely from rose-red rock. In the desert of what is now southern Jordan, the Nabatean civilization built one of the ancient world's most extraordinary cities, not constructed from blocks of stone, but carved directly into the sandstone cliffs of a narrow canyon. Temples, tombs, theaters, and houses were cut from the living rock, their facades ornate with columns and pediments in a style that blended Greek, Egyptian, and local Nabatean elements. The rock itself, banded in shades of red, pink, yellow, and white, made every surface a natural artwork. Petra was the capital of the Nabatean kingdom, which grew wealthy controlling the spice and incense trade routes between Arabia and the Mediterranean. At its height it may have had a population of 30,000 people. After Roman annexation in 106 CE and a series of earthquakes, Petra gradually depopulated. By the Byzantine period it was largely abandoned. By the medieval period it had been forgotten by the outside world. It was rediscovered by the Swiss explorer Johann Ludwig Burckhardt in 1812, guided there by local Bedouin who had never stopped knowing it existed. The city that had been lost to Europe had been home to local people all along. The Nabateans had mastered water engineering in one of the driest places on Earth. Petra receives less than 150 millimeters of rainfall per year. And yet it supported a city of tens of thousands. The Nabateans built an elaborate system of dams, cisterns, channels, and pipes that collected every drop of rainfall, redirected flash floods, and distributed water throughout the city. They cut channels into the cliff faces to direct water to storage pools carved from the rock. Their hydraulic engineering was so sophisticated that Petra had water pressure pipes arranged to allow water to flow uphill through siphon systems, centuries before such technology was common elsewhere. In a landscape where water was survival, they turned scarcity into abundance through ingenuity. The channels are still visible today, carved into the canyon walls, silent evidence of a civilization that refused to be defeated by its environment. Angkor Wat is the largest religious monument ever built. The Khmer Empire of Cambodia, at its height between the 9th and 15th centuries CE, built a complex of temples and cities in the jungle of northwestern Cambodia that staggers the imagination even today. Angkor Wat, built by King Suryavarman II in the 12th century, covers an area of about 400 acres and is surrounded by a moat 190 meters wide. Its towers represent the peaks of Mount Meru, the sacred mountain at the center of Hindu cosmology. Every surface is covered in bas-relief carvings depicting scenes from Hindu mythology, royal processions, and celestial dancers called apsaras, over 1,800 of them, no two with exactly the same face. It was built to last forever. And in one sense it is still standing, still used as a place of worship, the largest religious monument on earth. The city of Angkor that surrounded it was, at its height in the 12th century, the largest pre-industrial city in the world, home to perhaps 1 million people, covering an area the size of modern Los Angeles. Angkor was abandoned in the 15th century, but the jungle kept its secret badly. Unlike some lost cities, Angkor was never truly forgotten. Buddhist monks maintained Angkor Wat continuously through the centuries of the city's abandonment. Local Cambodian people always knew it was there. The discovery of Angkor by French naturalist Henri Mouhot in 1860 was actually a guided visit. Local guides took him directly to the temples. His breathless accounts in European publications presented it as a revelation to the world, while carefully omitting that he had been shown the way. This pattern, local knowledge dismissed, outsider discovery celebrated, recurs throughout the history of lost civilizations. What the jungle did hide, however, was the full extent of Angkor's urban landscape. LiDAR surveys completed between 2012 and 2015 revealed an urban sprawl far larger than previously understood, a city of extraordinary complexity extending far beyond the temple complexes into a managed landscape of reservoirs, rice paddies, and residential areas. The city was not lost in the jungle. The jungle was inside the city. The Khmer Empire may have been destroyed by climate change. For decades, the fall of Angkor was attributed to invasion by the Thai kingdom of Ayutthaya, which sacked the city in 1431. Recent research has complicated this picture. Analysis of tree rings, sediment cores, and the city's own water management infrastructure suggests that Angkor was severely stressed by prolonged drought and erratic monsoon patterns in the 14th and 15th centuries, a period of climate instability associated with what is sometimes called the Little Ice Age. The city's hydraulic system, those extraordinary reservoirs and canals that had sustained 1 million people, began to fail as rainfall patterns changed. Channels were modified, rebuilt, modified again, in increasingly desperate attempts to manage water that was no longer coming reliably. The Thai invasion of 1431 may have been less a cause of Angkor's fall than a coup de grace, a final blow to a civilization already weakened by a century of environmental stress. The greatest city of the medieval world may have been undone not by enemies but by weather. The city of Zimbabwe gave a country its name. In the interior of southern Africa, far from the coasts where most ancient trade routes ran, a civilization built a city of dry stone walls so impressive that European colonizers refused to believe Africans had constructed it. Great Zimbabwe, from the Shona word Zimbadzamabwe, meaning houses of stone, was the capital of a powerful kingdom that controlled the gold trade between the interior of Africa and the Swahili coast from roughly 1100 to 1450 CE. Its great enclosure, a circular wall 11 meters high and 5 meters thick, built without mortar, every stone precisely shaped and fitted, enclosed an area of nearly 10 acres. The walls still stand today, nearly 1,000 years after their construction. When European archaeologists first studied the site in the late 19th century, the colonial establishment insisted the walls must have been built by Phoenicians, Arabs, or ancient Israelites, anyone but the ancestors of the local Shona people. Archaeological evidence has definitively established that Great Zimbabwe was built by the ancestors of the Shona. The denial of this was not archaeology. It was racism. The country that gained independence in 1980 named itself Zimbabwe, taking the name of its greatest monument and reclaiming a history that had been stolen. The ancestral Puebloans built cities in cliffsides for reasons we still debate. In the Four Corners region of the American Southwest, between roughly 700 and 1300 CE, the people archaeologists call the ancestral Puebloans built some of the most dramatic architecture in North America, entire villages constructed in natural alcoves in cliff faces, hundreds of meters above the canyon floor. Cliff Palace at Mesa Verde, Colorado, contains over 150 rooms and 23 kivas, circular ceremonial chambers, all packed into a natural overhang in the cliff. It housed perhaps 125 people. Why did they build in such inaccessible locations? Defense is the obvious answer. Cliff dwellings are extraordinarily difficult to attack. And there is evidence of increased warfare and raiding in the region during the 13th century, when most cliff dwellings were constructed. But some archaeologists suggest ritual or cosmological reasons. The cliff face as a boundary between the human world and the spiritual world, the alcoves as liminal spaces between earth and sky. Around 1300 CE, the cliff dwellings were abandoned. The ancestral Puebloans moved south and east, eventually becoming the ancestors of modern Pueblo peoples. Their descendants are still here. The cliff dwellings they left behind remain almost perfectly preserved in the dry desert air, empty, silent, and extraordinary. Chaco Canyon was the center of a civilization that covered 250,000 square miles. In the high desert of what is now New Mexico, between roughly 850 and 1150 CE, the Chacoan civilization built something without parallel in ancient North America. Chaco Canyon was not merely a city, it was a ritual and administrative center connected to dozens of outlying communities by a network of roads. These roads were remarkable, straight, wide, sometimes paved, cutting across the landscape with geometric precision regardless of terrain. They were wide enough for large groups to travel side by side. Where the roads led to, in many cases, was not villages but empty plazas. Dead ends in the desert. This has led archaeologists to conclude that the roads were not primarily for transport but for ceremony, processional routes for pilgrimage and ritual. The great houses of Chaco, Pueblo Bonito, the largest, contained over 600 rooms and rose 4 or 5 stories, were not primarily residential. They show evidence of very small permanent populations relative to their enormous size. They may have been gathering places, used intensively during festivals and ceremonies and largely empty the rest of the time. Chaco was a place people came to, not a place people lived. A sacred center in the desert, drawing pilgrims from 250,000 square miles. The builders of Chaco aligned their great houses with extraordinary astronomical precision. Pueblo Bonito is oriented so that its back wall runs perfectly east-west. At the equinoxes, the sun rises and sets in direct alignment with this wall. The corner windows in certain rooms are positioned to capture the light of the sunrise at the winter solstice. The sun dagger site at Fajada Butte, a spiral petroglyph illuminated by daggers of light passing between stone slabs, marks the solstices and equinoxes with precision. The entire landscape of Chaco Canyon was, in a sense, a calendar, an instrument for tracking the movements of the sun and moon, calibrating ceremony to cosmic time. The Chacoan people did not simply live in their landscape. They read it, mapped it, aligned their greatest buildings to it, and made the turning of the year a visible, architectural fact. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey is the oldest known monumental structure on Earth, and it was buried on purpose. At the top of a hill in southeastern Turkey, about 12,000 years ago, a group of people who had not yet invented agriculture built a complex of massive stone pillars arranged in circles, carved with elaborate reliefs of animals, foxes, snakes, boars, ducks, scorpions, and strange abstract symbols. The pillars are T-shaped, up to 6 meters tall, weighing up to 20 tons each. They were cut from bedrock quarries using stone tools. Moving them to the hilltop would have required organized labor on a scale previously assumed impossible for hunter-gatherers. Göbekli Tepe is 4 times older than Stonehenge. It predates pottery. It predates the wheel. It predates agriculture by at least 1,000 years. This overturns what was the foundational assumption of archaeology, that monumental architecture requires settled agricultural civilization as a precondition. Göbekli Tepe suggests the reverse may be true, that the organizational demands of building monuments may have driven the development of agriculture, not the other way around. And then, around 8000 BCE, Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried. The people who built it filled it in with rubble, covering it carefully, preserving it perfectly. Why? We do not know. Perhaps it was ritual ending one age and beginning another. Perhaps the burial was itself the final ceremony. It lay buried for 10,000 years until a Kurdish shepherd noticed a strange stone protruding from the hillside in 1963. The people who built Stonehenge also built a timber version. At Dennington Walls, about 3 kilometers from Stonehenge, archaeologists have found evidence of an enormous wooden structure, a timber henge that may have been Stonehenge's counterpart. The theory developed by archaeologist Mike Parker Pearson suggests that Stonehenge and Dennington Walls were the two poles of a landscape of the dead and the living. The timber circle, built from organic, living material, was associated with life. Stonehenge, built from enduring stone, was associated with death and the ancestors. People may have processed from Dennington Walls along the River Avon and up to Stonehenge as part of elaborate funerary ceremonies, moving from the world of the living to the world of the dead, from wood to stone, from warmth to permanence. The landscape of Stonehenge was not a monument. It was a stage, an entire sacred geography designed for ritual movement between the worlds. Stonehenge was built in multiple phases over 1,500 years. The monument we see today, the famous Sarsen Stone Circle, was the final phase of a construction project that began around 3000 BCE and continued until about 1500 BCE. The first Stonehenge was a circular earthwork, a ditch and bank, with a ring of holes that may have held wooden posts or cremation deposits. Then came the bluestones, 82 stones of a specific type of spotted dolerite found only in the Preseli Hills of Wales, 250 kilometers away. How they were transported remains debated. By sea and river? By human muscle over land? By a glacier that had already moved them part way? Then the enormous Sarsen stones, some weighing up to 25 tons, hauled from Marlborough Downs 25 kilometers away, shaped with stone tools, fitted together with mortise and tenon joints usually used in woodworking. Generation after generation, for 15 centuries, people kept adding to it, modifying it, rearranging the bluestones, adjusting the alignments. Stonehenge was not built. It was continuously rebuilt, a project that outlasted any individual life, any single culture, any one purpose. What it meant changed over 1,500 years. We can only guess at what it meant at any particular moment. Easter Island statues were not left unfinished, they were abandoned mid-creation. The Moai of Easter Island, those enormous stone heads, which are actually full figures buried to the shoulders, have puzzled observers for centuries. The island is tiny, remote, and treeless now. How were statues weighing up to 82 tons moved from the quarry where they were carved to the coastal platforms where they stand? The answer, researchers now believe, is that the statues were rocked from side to side using ropes, moved upright in a motion that witnesses described as looking like walking. But in the quarry at Reino Raraku, hundreds of unfinished statues remain abandoned mid-carving, as though the workers simply stopped and never returned. They didn't simply stop. Something ended. The Rapa Nui people, who built the statues, faced an ecological and social collapse in the centuries before European contact. Deforestation, possibly partly natural, possibly accelerated by human activity, and the rats that arrived with the first settlers eliminated the trees needed for rope and transport. The statue building cult collapsed. And then European contact brought disease, slave raids, and cultural destruction. The abandoned statues are not a mystery. They are a record of interruption, a civilization stopped in its tracks. The people of Easter Island may not have caused their own deforestation. For decades, the story of Easter Island was used as a parable of ecological self-destruction, a civilization that cut down all its trees, triggering collapse. The warning was clear: this is what happens when humans destroy their environment. More recent research has complicated this narrative. Analysis of the island's pollen record shows that deforestation was already underway before human arrival, a natural process accelerated by climate. The rats that arrived with Polynesian settlers ate palm seeds, preventing forest regeneration. And the collapse was significantly worsened, possibly primarily caused by European contact, the diseases, slave raids, and cultural disruption of the 18th and 19th centuries. The Rapa Nui people were not uniquely destructive. They were people adapting to a difficult environment, managing resources as best they could, and ultimately overwhelmed by forces partly beyond their control. The parable of Easter Island may say more about how we construct warnings for ourselves than about what actually happened there. There is a city at the bottom of the Gulf of Khumbat in India. In 2001, the National Institute of Ocean Technology was conducting pollution surveys of the Gulf of Khumbat, formerly known as the Gulf of Cambay, off the northwestern coast of India, using sonar equipment. They found geometric structures on the seafloor at a depth of about 40 meters. Straight lines. Right angles. The kind of regularity that suggests human construction rather than natural formation. Subsequent dredging operations brought up artifacts including pottery, beads, a carved human tooth, and pieces of wood that were carbon dated to approximately 7,500 BC, making them, if correctly dated and associated, nearly 10,000 years old. The Gulf of Khumbat was dry land during the last ice age, when sea levels were much lower. If the structures are genuinely artificial, they represent a submerged city older than any previously known civilization. The discovery remains controversial. Marine archaeologists have raised questions about the sonar interpretation and the context of the dredged artifacts. The site has not been fully excavated. But the possibility remains, sitting quietly at the bottom of the Gulf, that an entire civilization was swallowed by the sea when the Ice Age ended, and has been waiting there for 10,000 years. The Bronze Age collapse was the most dramatic civilizational catastrophe in recorded history. Around 1200 BCE, within the space of roughly 50 years, almost every major civilization in the eastern Mediterranean collapsed simultaneously. The Mycenaean Greeks, gone. Their palace centers burned, their writing system abandoned, their trade networks severed. Greece entered a dark age from which it would not fully emerge for 4 centuries. The Hittite Empire, which had been one of the great powers of the ancient world, trading and warring with Egypt as an equal, gone. Their capital Hattusa burned and abandoned. The Ugarit civilization on the Syrian coast, gone. The last texts from Ugarit described ships being attacked, cities burning, famine spreading. And then silence. Egypt survived, barely, but was so severely weakened that it never fully recovered its former power. The causes are debated and likely multiple: invasions by mysterious groups called the Sea Peoples, drought, earthquakes, disruption of trade networks, internal rebellions. Most likely it was a combination, a cascade failure in which each collapse triggered others. It is the clearest example in ancient history of what happens when complex, interconnected civilizations meet simultaneous shocks. It took centuries for the Eastern Mediterranean to rebuild what was lost. The Sea Peoples who contributed to the Bronze Age collapse were themselves refugees. For much of the 20th century, the Sea Peoples were portrayed as invaders, aggressive outsiders attacking stable civilizations. Egyptian records from the reign of Ramesses III describe great sea battles and land invasions by groups with unfamiliar names. More recent scholarship has reframed this picture. The Sea Peoples appear to have been migrants, people displaced from their own collapsing homelands by drought, famine, and political breakdown, moving with their families and possessions in search of new places to settle. They were not destroyers attacking from outside a crisis. They were participants in the crisis, refugees swept up in the same collapse they are accused of causing. The destruction of the Bronze Age world may have been less an invasion than a great migration of desperate people, each group's movement destabilizing the next, in a cascade that brought everything down. The victims and the perpetrators were, in many cases, the same people. The ancient city of Carthage was so thoroughly destroyed that archaeologists still struggle to find it. Carthage, founded by Phoenician colonists from Tyre, probably in the 9th century BC, grew to become the dominant power of the western Mediterranean, controlling trade routes from Spain to Libya and fielding an empire that challenged Rome for supremacy of the ancient world. Its general Hannibal crossed the Alps with war elephants in 218 BCE and spent 15 years campaigning through Italy, winning extraordinary victories at Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and kenny battles still studied in military academies today. Rome ultimately prevailed. In 146 BC, after 3 Punic wars, Roman forces besieged, captured, and systematically demolished Carthage. They burned it, tore down its buildings, and sold its surviving population, perhaps 50,000 people, into slavery. The story that the Romans salted the earth to prevent anything growing there is almost certainly a myth invented in the 19th century. But the destruction was real. Modern Tunis sits on and around the site of ancient Carthage. Centuries of construction, destruction, and rebuilding have buried and scattered the archaeological remains so thoroughly that reconstructing what Carthage actually looked like is extraordinarily difficult. Rome did not just defeat Carthage. It erased it. The library of the ancient city of Ebla contains 17,000 clay tablets. In the 1970s, Italian archaeologists excavating the ancient Syrian city of Ebla, a Bronze Age metropolis that flourished around 2400 BCE, found a room that had once been a library. The shelves had long since rotted away. But the clay tablets that had sat on those shelves had fallen to the floor when the shelves burned, and lay there in the ash, preserved by the very fire that destroyed everything else. 17,000 tablets. Administrative records, trade agreements, diplomatic correspondence, mythological texts, school exercises, dictionaries. Ebla had schools. Children learned to read and write by copying word lists. The world's first dictionaries, used to teach a dead language to bureaucratic scribes, buried in the ruins of a forgotten city for 4,000 years. The Library of Ebla is a reminder that every lost civilization was once a place where people went to school, learned words, and tried to make sense of the world. The Olmec civilization of Mexico created the first colossal heads in the Americas, and we don't know who they depict. The Olmec, considered the mother culture of Mesoamerica, flourishing from roughly 1500 to 400 BCE along the Gulf Coast of Mexico, produced enormous stone heads, some nearly 3 meters tall, carved from basalt boulders transported from mountains 80 kilometers away. 17 have been found. Each has distinct, individualized facial features, flat noses, thick lips, eyes that seem to look directly at you. Each wears a helmet or headdress. The most widely accepted interpretation is that they depict rulers or important individuals. The individualized features suggest portraiture rather than idealized type. But we have no writing from the Olmec civilization. We have no names for the people depicted. We cannot confirm any interpretation. The faces look at us. We do not know who they are. The city of Teotihuacan was one of the largest cities in the ancient world, and we don't know what language its people spoke. At its height around 450 CE, Teotihuacan in the Valley of Mexico had a population of perhaps 125,000 to 200,000 people, one of the 5 largest cities on Earth at that time. Its Pyramid of the Sun is the 3rd largest pyramid in the world by volume. We do not know what the people of Teotihuacan called themselves or their city. The name Teotihuacan comes from the Nahuatl language of the Aztecs, who encountered the ruins centuries after the city's collapse and named it the place where the gods were created. We do not know what language they spoke. We have examples of their writing glyphs found on murals and ceramics, but have not deciphered it. We do not know the names of their rulers because we cannot find evidence that they depicted individual rulers at all. which is extraordinary for an ancient civilization. Teotihuacan may have been governed not by kings but by some form of collective leadership, a council, a priestly hierarchy, something we have no good model for. Its collapse around 550 CE involved the burning of the city's central ceremonial district, but whether this burning was caused by internal revolt, external invasion, or ritual destruction is unknown. A city of 200,000 people, nameless, speakerless, unknowable. The ancient Peruvian city of Tiwanaku sat at an altitude of 3,850 meters above sea level. Near the southern shore of Lake Titicaca in what is now Bolivia, the Tiwanaku civilization built a ceremonial center at an altitude where most crops cannot grow and where the air contains roughly 60% of the oxygen available at sea level. They solved the agricultural problem with raised field agriculture, an ingenious system of elevated planting platforms surrounded by water channels, which absorbed heat during the day and released it at night, creating a microclimate warm enough to grow crops despite the extreme altitude and the frequent frosts. Their ceremonial architecture included the Acapana Pyramid and the Kalasasaya Temple, whose precise stone alignments tracked astronomical events. The Gateway of the Sun, a single stone monolith carved with a central deity figure, weighs 10 tons and was carved with tools that left no mark on the stone surface that we have been able to replicate. Tiwanaku collapsed around 1000 CE, probably due to prolonged drought that disrupted the raised field agriculture system. The water that sustained the fields dried up, and the city that had fed its population through ingenious engineering could no longer feed anyone. There may be a lost city beneath the Amazon rainforest. For centuries, early European explorers in the Amazon reported enormous cities along the river, dense populations, roads, cultivated landscapes extending for kilometers. These accounts were dismissed as exaggerations or fantasies by later scientists who found only small, scattered indigenous communities living in what they described as pristine wilderness. Recent archaeology has rehabilitated the early accounts. Soil studies have revealed vast areas of terra preta, dark earth, across the Amazon basin. This soil is extraordinarily fertile, rich in charcoal and organic matter, and is not natural. It was created by humans, over centuries, through the deliberate incorporation of charcoal and organic waste into the soil. It covers an estimated 0.1 to 0.3% of the Amazon, an area the size of France. Where terra preta exists, people live densely and for a long time. LiDAR surveys have revealed geometric earthworks, ditches, mounds, causeways beneath the jungle canopy across a vast area of the Amazon. These earthworks predate European contact and suggest a population in the millions. The Amazon was not a wilderness when Europeans arrived. It was a managed landscape, a garden continent, home to civilizations we had dismissed as impossible. What happened to those civilizations? Disease. The epidemics that swept through the Americas after European contact reduced some indigenous populations by 90%. By the time later Europeans explored the interior, the cities were gone and the forest had reclaimed them. The Amazon hides not one lost civilization but many, and we are only beginning to find them. The Aksumite Empire of Ethiopia was one of the great powers of the ancient world. Between roughly the 1st and 7th centuries CE, the Aksumite Empire controlled trade routes between the Roman Empire, Arabia, and India. Its capital Aksum minted its own coins, one of only 3 polities in the world at that time to do so, alongside Rome and Persia. The Aksumites converted to Christianity in the 4th century CE, making Ethiopia one of the world's first Christian nations. Their tradition of the Ark of the Covenant, which Ethiopian Orthodox Christians believe is held at Aksum to this day, guarded by a single monk who never leaves the chapel that houses it, stretches back to this period. Their most dramatic monuments are the stelae, enormous obelisks carved from single granite slabs, the largest of which, now fallen, would have stood 33 meters tall and weighed 520 tons. It would have been the largest single stone structure ever erected. How these stelae were raised remains debated. The technology required would have been extraordinary. Aksum declined after the 7th century, as the rise of Islam disrupted its Red Sea trade routes. But it did not disappear, it transformed into the foundation of the Ethiopian state, which has maintained continuous existence to the present. Not lost. Transformed. The city of Pompeii preserved a Roman city in a single moment, and that moment is still being excavated. In 79 CE, Mount Vesuvius erupted and buried the Roman city of Pompeii under several meters of volcanic ash and pumice. Within 18 hours, approximately 2,000 people were dead and an entire city was preserved in the moment of its destruction. Pompeii had bakeries with carbonized loaves still in their ovens. Wine bars with amphorae still on their shelves. Houses with gardens preserved in the ash, so precisely that archaeologists can pour plaster into the cavities left by decomposed root systems and reconstruct what was growing there 2,000 years ago. And they are still finding things. The ongoing excavations of Pompeii's unexcavated sections, about a third of the city has never been dug, continue to produce extraordinary discoveries. A fast food counter with vivid painted decorations. A ceremonial room with mythological frescoes of astonishing quality. The remains of a man killed, the archaeologists believe, by a falling block while trying to escape. Pompeii is not lost. It is the most intensively studied site in classical archaeology. But every year it gives up something new, a reminder that even the most familiar ruins still hold surprises. The eruption that buried Pompeii also preserved the words of a man watching it happen. Pliny the Younger, a Roman author and lawyer, was 17 years old when Vesuvius erupted. He was staying with his uncle, Pliny the Elder, at Misenum, across the Bay of Naples. His uncle sailed toward the eruption to attempt a rescue and died on the beach, overcome by sulfurous fumes. Pliny the Younger survived. Years later, he wrote 2 letters to the historian Tacitus describing what he had witnessed: the cloud shaped like an umbrella pine rising from the mountain, the darkness that fell over the bay, the ash raining down, the earthquake tremors, the people who had fled and the people who had stayed. His letters are the only eyewitness account of a volcanic eruption from the ancient world. They are so precise and so accurate that volcanologists today use the term Plinian eruption to describe eruptions of this type, columns of ash rising kilometers into the stratosphere. A 17-year-old watching the world end across the bay, and writing it down with enough precision that scientists still use his words 2,000 years later. The ancestral Puebloans left a message for future generations at Chaco Canyon. In a small room in one of Chaco's great houses, archaeologists found a deposit of macaw feathers and turquoise, materials of great ritual value, buried carefully in a spot that suggested deliberate placement rather than casual discard. The interpretation offered by some researchers, and supported by the oral traditions of some modern Pueblo peoples, is that this was a ritual closing deposit, placed when the great house was intentionally abandoned. A way of sealing the space, acknowledging its importance, and committing it to the past. It was not an accident of preservation. It was a message. Somebody, 1,000 years ago, knew they were leaving. They prepared the space for its long sleep. They left something behind to mark what had happened there. The act of leaving, done carefully, deliberately, with ceremony, is itself a kind of document. A civilization saying goodbye to a place it had made sacred. The ancient Greeks believed the world had passed through 4 ages before their own. Hesiod, writing around 700 BCE, described a succession of ages: gold, silver, bronze, and the age of heroes, each one diminished from the last, each one ending in destruction or transformation. This was not unique to the Greeks. Cultures around the world share versions of this story, the idea that the present is a fallen state, that there were golden ages before, that civilization has declined from some original perfection. Joseph Campbell and others have argued this is a universal human story, emerging from the psychological fact that each generation looks back on a simpler, purer past that probably never existed quite as remembered. But there is another possibility. The Bronze Age collapse really did happen. The destruction of Mycenae, Troy, Hattusa, and Ugarit really was catastrophic in living in the cultural memory of the Greeks. The Age of Heroes, the age of the Trojan War, really was a time of greater power and complexity than the Dark Age that followed. The Greek myth of fallen ages may be, in part, a distorted memory of an actual fall, the civilization that ended around 1200 BC and took centuries to rebuild. The myth is not just a myth. It is history wearing a story's clothes. The Library of Alexandria was not destroyed in a single fire. The Great Library of Alexandria, repository of perhaps the greatest collection of written knowledge in the ancient world, has become a symbol of civilizational loss. Its destruction, in popular imagination, was a single catastrophic event that plunged the world into darkness. The reality is more complicated and in some ways sadder. The library declined gradually over centuries. Julius Caesar's fire in 48 BCE damaged part of the harbor district but may not have directly touched the main library. The decline of patronage under later Roman emperors was probably more damaging. The burning of the Serapeum by Christian mobs in 391 CE destroyed a daughter library. The Arab conquest in 642 CE has been blamed, but the evidence for this is weak and contested. The library probably did not die in a fire. It faded as funding dried up, as scholars went elsewhere, as papyrus scrolls deteriorated and were not replaced, as the political will to maintain a universal repository of knowledge simply dissipated. It was not burned. It was neglected to death. This is, perhaps, a more sobering lesson than destruction by fire. Civilizational knowledge can be lost not through catastrophe but through a long, slow failure of will, a decision, made generation by generation, that the preservation of knowledge is not worth the cost. The Olmec civilization of Mexico created the first colossal heads in the Americas, and we don't know who they depict. The Olmec, considered the mother culture of Mesoamerica, flourishing from roughly 1500 to 400 BCE along the Gulf Coast of Mexico, produced enormous stone heads, some nearly 3 meters tall, carved from basalt boulders transported from mountains 80 kilometers away. 17 have been found. Each has distinct, individualized facial features, flat noses, thick lips, eyes that seem to look directly at you. Each wears a helmet or headdress. The most widely accepted interpretation is that they depict rulers or important individuals. The individualized features suggest portraiture rather than idealized type. But we have no writing from the Olmec civilization. We have no names for the people depicted. We cannot confirm any interpretation. The faces look at us. We do not know who they are. The city of Teotihuacan was one of the largest cities in the ancient world, and we don't know what language its people spoke. At its height around 450 CE, Teotihuacan in the Valley of Mexico had a population of perhaps 125,000 to 200,000 people, one of the 5 largest cities on Earth at that time. Its Pyramid of the Sun is the 3rd largest pyramid in the world by volume. We do not know what the people of Teotihuacan called themselves or their city. The name Teotihuacan comes from the Nahuatl language of the Aztecs, who encountered the ruins centuries after the city's collapse and named it the place where the gods were created. We do not know what language they spoke. We have examples of their writing glyphs found on murals and ceramics, but have not deciphered it. We do not know the names of their rulers because we cannot find evidence that they depicted individual rulers at all, which is extraordinary for an ancient civilization. Teotihuacan may have been governed not by kings but by some form of collective leadership, a council, a priestly hierarchy, something we have no good model for. Its collapse around 550 CE involved the burning of the city's central ceremonial district, but whether this burning was caused by internal revolt, external invasion, or ritual destruction is unknown. A city of 200,000 people, nameless, speakerless, unknowable. The ancient Peruvian city of Tiwanaku sat at an altitude of 3,850 meters above sea level. Near the southern shore of Lake Titicaca in what is now Bolivia, the Tiwanaku civilization built a ceremonial center at an altitude where most crops cannot grow and where the air contains roughly 60% of the oxygen available at sea level. They solved the agricultural problem with raised field agriculture, an ingenious system of elevated planting platforms surrounded by water channels, which absorbed heat during the day and released it at night, creating a microclimate warm enough to grow crops despite the extreme altitude and the frequent frosts. Their ceremonial architecture included the Akapana Pyramid and the Kalasasaya Temple, whose precise stone alignments tracked astronomical events. The Gateway of the Sun, a single stone monolith carved with a central deity figure, weighs 10 tons and was carved with tools that left no mark on the stone surface that we have been able to replicate. Tiwanaku collapsed around 1000 CE, probably due to prolonged drought that disrupted the raised field agriculture system. The water that sustained the fields dried up, and the city that had fed its population through ingenious engineering could no longer feed anyone. There may be a lost city beneath the Amazon rainforest. For centuries, early European explorers in the Amazon reported enormous cities along the river, dense populations, roads, cultivated landscapes extending for kilometers. These accounts were dismissed as exaggerations or fantasies by later scientists who found only small, scattered indigenous communities living in what they described as pristine wilderness. Recent archaeology has rehabilitated the early accounts. Soil studies have revealed vast areas of terra preta, dark earth, across the Amazon basin. This soil is extraordinarily fertile, rich in charcoal and organic matter, and is not natural. It was created by humans, over centuries, through the deliberate incorporation of charcoal and organic waste into the soil. It covers an estimated 0.1 to 0.3% of the Amazon, an area the size of France. Where terra preta exists, people live densely and for a long time. LiDAR surveys have revealed geometric earthworks, ditches, mounds, causeways beneath the jungle canopy across a vast area of the Amazon. These earthworks predate European contact and suggest a population in the millions. The Amazon was not a wilderness when Europeans arrived. It was a managed landscape, a garden continent, home to civilizations we had dismissed as impossible. What happened to those civilizations? Disease. The epidemics that swept through the Americas after European contact reduced some indigenous populations by 90%. By the time later Europeans explored the interior, the cities were gone and the forest had reclaimed them. The Amazon hides not one lost civilization but many, and we are only beginning to find them. The Aksumite Empire of Ethiopia was one of the great powers of the ancient world. Between roughly the 1st and 7th centuries CE, the Aksumite Empire controlled trade routes between the Roman Empire, Arabia, and India. Its capital Aksum minted its own coins, one of only 3 polities in the world at that time to do so, alongside Rome and Persia. The Aksumites converted to Christianity in the 4th century CE, making Ethiopia one of the world's first Christian nations. Their tradition of the Ark of the Covenant, which Ethiopian Orthodox Christians believe is held at Aksum to this day, guarded by a single monk who never leaves the chapel that houses it, stretches back to this period. Their most dramatic monuments are the stelae, enormous obelisks carved from single granite slabs, the largest of which, now fallen, would have stood 33 meters tall and weighed 520 tons. It would have been the largest single stone structure ever erected. How these stelae were raised remains debated. The technology required would have been extraordinary. Aksum declined after the 7th century, as the rise of Islam disrupted its Red Sea trade routes. But it did not disappear, it transformed into the foundation of the Ethiopian state, which has maintained continuous existence to the present. Not lost. Transformed. The city of Pompeii preserved a Roman city in a single moment, and that moment is still being excavated. In 79 CE, Mount Vesuvius erupted and buried the Roman city of Pompeii under several meters of volcanic ash and pumice. Within 18 hours, approximately 2,000 people were dead and an entire city was preserved in the moment of its destruction. Pompeii had bakeries with carbonized loaves still in their ovens. Wine bars with amphorae still on their shelves. Houses with gardens preserved in the ash, so precisely that archaeologists can pour plaster into the cavities left by decomposed root systems and reconstruct what was growing there 2,000 years ago. And they are still finding things. The ongoing excavations of Pompeii's unexcavated sections, about a third of the city has never been dug, continue to produce extraordinary discoveries. A fast food counter with vivid painted decorations. A ceremonial room with mythological frescoes of astonishing quality. The remains of a man killed, the archaeologists believe, by a falling block while trying to escape. Pompeii is not lost. It is the most intensively studied site in classical archaeology. But every year it gives up something new, a reminder that even the most familiar ruins still hold surprises. The eruption that buried Pompeii also preserved the words of a man watching it happen. Pliny the Younger, a Roman author and lawyer, was 17 years old when Vesuvius erupted. He was staying with his uncle, Pliny the Elder, at Misenum, across the Bay of Naples. His uncle sailed toward the eruption to attempt a rescue and died on the beach, overcome by sulfurous fumes. Pliny the Younger survived. Years later, he wrote 2 letters to the historian Tacitus describing what he had witnessed: the cloud shaped like an umbrella pine rising from the mountain, the darkness that fell over the bay, the ash raining down, the earthquake tremors, the people who had fled and the people who had stayed. His letters are the only eyewitness account of a volcanic eruption from the ancient world. They are so precise and so accurate that volcanologists today use the term Plinian eruption to describe eruptions of this type, columns of ash rising kilometers into the stratosphere. A 17-year-old watching the world end across the bay, and writing it down with enough precision that scientists still use his words 2,000 years later. The ancestral Puebloans left a message for future generations at Chaco Canyon. In a small room in one of Chaco's great houses, archaeologists found a deposit of macaw feathers and turquoise, materials of great ritual value, buried carefully in a spot that suggested deliberate placement rather than casual discard. The interpretation offered by some researchers, and supported by the oral traditions of some modern Pueblo peoples, is that this was a ritual closing deposit, placed when the great house was intentionally abandoned. A way of sealing the space, acknowledging its importance, and committing it to the past. It was not an accident of preservation. It was a message. Somebody, 1,000 years ago, knew they were leaving. They prepared the space for its long sleep. They left something behind to mark what had happened there. The act of leaving, done carefully, deliberately, with ceremony, is itself a kind of document. A civilization saying goodbye to a place it had made sacred. The ancient Greeks believed the world had passed through 4 ages before their own. Hesiod, writing around 700 BCE, described a succession of ages: gold, silver, bronze, and the age of heroes, each one diminished from the last, each one ending in destruction or transformation. This was not unique to the Greeks. Cultures around the world share versions of this story, the idea that the present is a fallen state, that there were golden ages before, that civilization has declined from some original perfection. Joseph Campbell and others have argued this is a universal human story, emerging from the psychological fact that each generation looks back on a simpler, purer past that probably never existed quite as remembered. But there is another possibility. The Bronze Age collapse really did happen. The destruction of Mycenae, Troy, Hattusa, and Ugarit really was catastrophic and living in the cultural memory of the Greeks. The Age of Heroes, the age of the Trojan War, really was a time of greater power and complexity than the Dark Age that followed. The Greek myth of fallen ages may be, in part, a distorted memory of an actual fall, the civilization that ended around 1200 BC and took centuries to rebuild. The myth is not just a myth. It is history wearing a story's clothes. The Library of Alexandria was not destroyed in a single fire. The Great Library of Alexandria, repository of perhaps the greatest collection of written knowledge in the ancient world, has become a symbol of civilizational loss. Its destruction, in popular imagination, was a single catastrophic event that plunged the world into darkness. The reality is more complicated and in some ways sadder. The library declined gradually over centuries. Julius Caesar's fire in 48 BCE damaged part of the harbor district but may not have directly touched the main library. The decline of patronage under later Roman emperors was probably more damaging. The burning of the Serapeum by Christian mobs in 391 CE destroyed a daughter library. The Arab conquest in 642 CE has been blamed, but the evidence for this is weak and contested. The library probably did not die in a fire. It faded as funding dried up, as scholars went elsewhere, as papyrus scrolls deteriorated and were not replaced, as the political will to maintain a universal repository of knowledge simply dissipated. It was not burned. It was neglected to death. This is, perhaps, a more sobering lesson than destruction by fire. Civilizational knowledge can be lost not through catastrophe but through a long, slow failure of will, a decision, made generation by generation, that the preservation of knowledge is not worth the cost. Roman concrete has lasted 2,000 years, and we are still learning how. Modern concrete degrades over decades. Roman marine concrete, the kind used to build harbors and structures that sat in seawater, has lasted 2,000 years and in some cases is getting stronger over time. The secret, discovered through materials analysis in 2017, is volcanic ash. Roman concrete incorporated pozzolana, volcanic ash from the area around Pozzuoli, near Naples. When seawater infiltrated cracks in the concrete, it reacted with the ash to form new mineral crystals that filled the cracks and reinforced the structure. Roman concrete healed itself. The knowledge of this formulation was not lost through ignorance. It was lost through the collapse of the Roman economic and political system, the trade networks that distributed pozzolana, the institutional knowledge that specified its use, the workshops that trained the craftsmen who mixed it. When Rome fell, the concrete stopped being made correctly. The knowledge existed in texts, but texts without practitioners, without people who had made the concrete themselves and knew the feel of it, were insufficient. Some knowledge lives in hands, not in books. The lost city of El Dorado was not a city. The Spanish conquistadors who arrived in South America in the 16th century heard stories of a king who, in ritual ceremony, covered himself in gold dust and bathed in a sacred lake, offering the gold to the gods. This ritual, El Dorado, the gilded one, was real. It was practiced by the Muisca people of what is now Colombia at Lake Guatavita. Enormous quantities of gold were thrown into the lake as offerings, and the ritual was a genuine ceremony of great spiritual significance. The Spanish heard this story and transformed it. The Golden King became a golden city. The ritual offering became a hidden hoard. Hundreds of expeditions spent centuries and cost thousands of lives searching for a city that was always a mistranslation. They were looking for the wrong thing. The gold was not hidden in a city. It was in the lake. And it was not hidden, it was given. Offered to the gods. Gone by intention, not by loss. The greatest treasure hunt in history was a quest for something that was never where the hunters were looking. The builders of the Great Pyramids were not slaves. This is one of the most persistent misconceptions about ancient Egypt, partly sustained by the biblical narrative of Hebrew slaves in Egypt, partly by the assumption that monumental architecture requires forced labor. Archaeological excavation of the workers' village near Giza has revealed a different picture. The workers were paid in bread, beer, and meat. They had access to medical care, their bones show evidence of healed injuries, including amputations that the patient survived. They were organized into named teams with what appear to be competitive identities, friends of Khufu versus drunkards of Menkaure. They were skilled workers, not slaves. Some were permanent employees. Others were rotating crews serving for a period as a form of tax or national service. And they were proud of their work. Graffiti found near the pyramid sites, left by the workers themselves, boasts of their crew's strength and speed. The pyramids were built by free men who chose to be part of something larger than themselves, a monument to a god-king that would stand forever. They were right about the forever. The ancient city of Cahokia was, for a time, the largest city north of Mexico. At its height around 1100 CE, Cahokia, located near modern St. Louis, Missouri, had a population of perhaps 10,000 to 20,000 people, making it the largest pre-Columbian city north of the Rio Grande. Its central feature, Monk's Mound, is the largest pre-Columbian earthwork in North America, a platform mound covering 14 acres at its base and rising 30 meters high, built entirely by hand, one basket of earth at a time. Cahokia also contained a series of large wooden circles, called Woodhenge by archaeologists, whose posts were aligned with the sunrise at the solstices and equinoxes. A solar calendar built from wood, in a city of earthworks, in the middle of North America. Around 1350 CE, Cahokia was abandoned. The causes are debated: environmental stress, political fragmentation, the exhaustion of local resources. When French explorers arrived in the 17th century, the mounds were there but the city was empty. Local tribes knew of the mounds but did not claim to have built them. An entire urban civilization, risen and fallen and forgotten, in the heart of what would become the United States. The Easter Island statues have bodies. This is not quite a lost civilization fact, but it is a persistent misconception worth correcting. The famous Moai of Easter Island appear, in most photographs, to be just heads. They are not. The statues are full-body figures, with arms, torsos, and hands carved in detail. They are buried to the shoulders in soil that accumulated around them over centuries. Excavations have revealed inscriptions on the torsos, petroglyphs carved into the stone at the back of statues that were always intended to be below ground level. This means the statues were not meant to be fully seen. The buried portion, the hidden body, the invisible inscriptions, was as important as the visible head. The part that faced the sky and the part that went into the earth were both part of the same statement. What statement? We are not sure. But the Moai are not what they appear to be. They never were. The ancient Egyptians had a word for the feeling of homesickness. The word is ib, often translated simply as heart, but used in contexts that suggest something more complex: the emotional center of a person, the seat of longing, the place where absence lives. Egyptian texts describe soldiers on campaign feeling their ib pull toward home. Sailors describe their ib reaching toward the Nile. Officials posted in foreign lands write of their ib being left behind at the moment of departure. The ancient Egyptians felt homesick. They had a word for it. They wrote poems about it. This seems obvious, and yet it needs saying. The people of lost civilizations were not abstractions. They were not simply the ancients. They were people who missed their families, who felt the pull of home, who wrote letters and poems about the places they loved and could not return to. When a civilization is lost, what is lost is not just monuments and writing and technology. What is lost is the particular texture of human experience that existed in that place and time. The jokes that were funny. The songs that were sad. The specific quality of light in the morning in a city that no longer exists. That is what is truly gone. The Maya had a concept called Kayan, a word meaning both sun and day and time. For the Maya, these three things were not distinct. The sun was not simply a ball of fire in the sky, it was time made visible. Each day was the sun's journey. Each year was the sun's cycle. Time was not an abstract dimension, it was a living, divine force that moved through the world in the body of the sun. This is why Maya astronomy and Maya religion were inseparable. To track the sun was not to do science, it was to understand the divine. To predict an eclipse was to know the mind of the gods. The precision of Maya astronomical knowledge, which allowed them to predict Venus's cycles to within 2 hours over a 500-year period, was not separate from their spiritual life. It was the same thing. We have inherited the idea that science and religion are opposed. The Maya had no such opposition. Understanding the sky was worship. Worship was understanding the sky. A different way of knowing the world, encoded in a civilization we call lost. The city of Nan Madol in the Pacific was built on artificial islands. Off the eastern shore of the island of Pohnpei in Micronesia, the ancient city of Nan Madol was constructed on a series of artificial islands built in the shallow tidal flats of a lagoon. Between roughly 1200 and 1500 CE, the rulers of the Sodalur dynasty built their capital here, a complex of nearly 100 artificial islands connected by canals, constructed from enormous basalt boulders weighing up to 50 tons each. How the stones were transported to the site, some from quarries on the other side of the island, is unknown. Local oral tradition says they were flown through the air by magic. The city was abandoned after a rebellion overthrew the Sodalur dynasty around 1628 CE. The reasons for its abandonment and the decline of the civilization that built it are not fully known. Nan Madol sits in the lagoon today, largely unexcavated, its basalt platforms slowly sinking into the sea as the islands subside. UNESCO has listed it as a World Heritage Site in danger. A city built on the water, returning to the water, slowly, over centuries. The collapse of a civilization does not mean its people die. This is perhaps the most important fact in this entire journey. When we say a civilization collapsed, we conjure images of populations dying, cities burning, knowledge vanishing. Sometimes this happened. The Mongol destruction of Merv was genuinely catastrophic. The Bronze Age collapse genuinely killed enormous numbers of people and lost genuine knowledge. But more often, civilization collapse means transformation. The classic Maya collapse ended a form of political and cultural organization. The Maya people survived and adapted. The fall of Rome ended the Western Roman Empire. The people of Rome did not vanish, they became medieval Europeans. The abandonment of Cahokia did not mean the end of the people who built it, it meant dispersal, adaptation, the carrying of knowledge and culture and identity into new forms. Most people who lived through the collapse of their civilization did not experience it as collapse. They experienced it as change, difficult, disruptive change, often catastrophic change, but change that they navigated and survived. We call these civilizations lost because we have lost access to them. The people who lived in them did not consider themselves lost. They were simply living. Some things have been rediscovered multiple times. The technique of making blue pigment Egyptian blue, one of the first synthetic pigments ever created, was lost after the fall of Rome. For over 1,000 years, the formula was unknown. It was rediscovered in the 19th century by chemists analyzing ancient artifacts. The technique of Damascus steel, the legendary sword metal produced in the Middle East from roughly the 3rd century CE, which produced blades of extraordinary sharpness and resilience with distinctive watered patterns, was lost around 1750 CE when the trade routes that supplied the specific ore needed to make it were disrupted. Modern metallurgists have partially recreated it using carbon nanotube structures not fully understood until the 21st century. The ancients, working by experiment and tradition, achieved results that modern science with electron microscopes and materials analysis is still learning to explain. Knowledge is not always progressive. Sometimes it goes in circles. Sometimes it peaks and falls and is painfully rediscovered. Sometimes what was known 10 centuries ago is being learned again today. The oldest known story in the world is about a man who was afraid of death. The Epic of Gilgamesh, written on clay tablets in Sumer, Mesopotamia, in versions dating back to at least 2100 BC, tells the story of Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, a demigod of great power and terrible pride. When his beloved friend Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh is consumed by grief and terror. He sets out to find the secret of immortality. He fails. A tavern keeper at the edge of the world tells him, when the gods created mankind, they kept death for themselves and gave life to man. You will not find what you are looking for. But the food you have, eat it. The drink you have, drink it. Look at the child who holds your hand. Let your wife delight in your embrace. This is the task of mankind. 4,000 years ago, a scribe in a city that no longer exists, writing in a language that was dead for 2,000 years before it was deciphered, wrote the oldest story we know. And it is about learning to accept that you will die. Nothing is new. Nothing, perhaps, was ever new. The oldest story in the world is the one you already know. The libraries of the ancient world held works we will never read. The library at Alexandria is estimated to have held between 40,000 and 700,000 scrolls. The range of estimates reflects how little we know. Ancient sources give wildly different figures. What we know is this: plays by Sophocles and Euripides that have not survived. But complete works of philosophers we know only from fragments and references. Scientific and mathematical treatises that may have contained knowledge independently rediscovered centuries later. Poetry and languages we no longer speak. We know these things existed because other ancient writers quoted from them, referenced them, described them. The shadows of lost books fall across the books that survived. Aristotle is known to have written dialogues, philosophical conversations in the style of Plato, praised in antiquity as among the finest prose ever written. Not one survives. We have only his lecture notes. We are reading the notes. The beautiful writing is gone. The last speaker of a language takes an entire civilization's worth of knowledge with them. When the last fluent speaker of a language dies, the world loses something irreplaceable. A language is not just a way of expressing thoughts that could be expressed in another language. It is a way of structuring thought, of categorizing the world, of encoding relationships between things that other languages do not see. The indigenous languages of the Americas, of Australia, of Africa, of Asia contain accumulated knowledge about local ecosystems, medicinal plants, astronomical observations, navigational techniques, and ways of understanding the world that exist nowhere else. Linguists estimate that of the roughly 7,000 languages currently spoken on Earth, about half are expected to fall silent within this century. We are living through a mass extinction of languages, and with each language, a civilization's worth of accumulated knowledge and ways of seeing goes with it, as silently and finally as a library burning. Some civilizations left no trace at all. The history we can reconstruct is the history of civilizations that built with stone, wrote on durable materials, or happened to be in environments where organic materials were preserved. But countless civilizations built with wood, wove their records in textiles that have rotted, kept their knowledge in oral traditions that died with the last elder who knew them, built in tropical environments where the soil consumes everything. These civilizations are not lost to us. They are simply absent, without even a fragment to indicate they existed. Every civilization built in wood, in every forested region of the world over the past 100,000 years, is invisible to us unless an extraordinary accident of preservation intervened. The history we know is the history of stone and clay and dry desert air. The history of wood in memory and wet forest is gone without a trace. How much history has no trace? We cannot know. By definition, we cannot know. Stonehenge was not built by the Druids. The Druids were a priestly class of the Celtic peoples, who arrived in Britain around 600 BCE. Stonehenge was largely complete by 1500 BC, over 1,000 years before the Druids existed. This does not stop modern neo-Druid groups from celebrating the solstice at Stonehenge, which they do every year. The association, though historically wrong, has become culturally real through centuries of repetition. This is how mythology works. Stonehenge has been associated with magic, giants, Merlin, druids, and aliens, none of whom built it. What built it were ordinary human beings with extraordinary commitment, working with ropes and wooden sledges in sheer collective determination over 15 centuries. The actual builders are more impressive than the myths we have invented to replace them. We find it easier to believe in druids or aliens than in the sustained effort of ordinary people doing something extraordinary. The Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan was, at the time of the Spanish conquest, one of the largest cities in the world. When Hernán Cortés arrived in 1519, Tenochtitlan sat on an island in Lake Texcoco, connected to the shore by 3 great causeways. Its population was perhaps 200,000 to 300,000 larger than any city in Europe at the time except possibly Constantinople. The Spanish soldiers with Cortés rode home in astonishment: the markets, the architecture, the canals, the gardens, the sheer ordered complexity of the city. Within 2 years, it was destroyed. The Spanish siege of Tenochtitlan in 1521 lasted 75 days. When the city finally fell, most of it was rubble. The Aztec Emperor Cuauhtémoc was captured and later executed. Mexico City was built on the ruins and beneath it. Construction projects in Mexico City still routinely expose Aztec ruins, artifacts, and human remains. The foundations of the modern capital sit on the bones of the ancient one. The civilization is gone. The city is still there, buried under the one that replaced it. The Spanish destroyed almost all Maya books. When the Spanish friar Diego de Landa arrived in the Yucatan in the 1540s, he found that the Maya maintained a rich tradition of written literature on folding bark paper books called codices. In 1562, believing the books contained superstition and lies of the devil, de Landa ordered a bonfire. Dozens of Maya codices, the accumulated written knowledge of a civilization, were burned. De Landa later wrote, "We found a large number of books in these characters and, as they contained nothing in which there were not to be seen superstition and lies of the devil, we burned them all, which they regretted to an amazing degree and which caused them great affliction." He noticed their affliction. He burned the books anyway. Of the hundreds or thousands of Maya codices that existed, only 4 survive today. 4. The rest are ash. We have been trying to reconstruct what they contained ever since, from the 4 survivors, from stone inscriptions, from oral traditions, from the careful work of scholars and the descendants of the Maya themselves. De Landa, the man who ordered the burning, was himself later tried by his superiors for abuse of authority. He survived the trial and went on to write an invaluable account of Maya culture, including enough detail about the Maya writing system that modern scholars were eventually able to use it as a key to decipherment. The man who burned the books also helped us read what survived them. Ancient Mesopotamia had banks, contracts, and interest-bearing loans 5,000 years ago. The temples of ancient Sumer served as banks, storing grain and silver, making loans to farmers and merchants, charging interest. Clay tablets recording these transactions survive in the tens of thousands. They contain loans, receipts, inventories, wage records, legal contracts, letters of credit. The economic life of ancient cities, preserved in clay. They also contain something more unexpected: letters. Among the clay tablets are private letters, people writing to each other about business disputes, family matters, complaints. A woman writes to her son reproaching him for not visiting. A merchant writes angrily about a shipment of copper that was defective. The oldest personal complaint letter in the world, written around 1750 BCE, is from a man named Ionasir to a copper merchant named Nani. Nani is furious about bad copper ingots and wants everyone to know it. 4,000 years later, his complaint tablet is the oldest personal letter we have found. He got his grievance down for the ages. The copper merchant who wronged him has been famous for being in the wrong for 4 millennia. Some things about humanity do not change. The decline of the Roman Empire took 300 years. This is important to understand. The Western Roman Empire did not fall on a single day. It faded over centuries, a long, slow unraveling of institutions, economic systems, military capacity, and cultural confidence. Edward Gibbon, who wrote The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire in the 18th century, traced the decline across 6 volumes in 14 centuries. He attributed it to many causes: military overextension, economic decline, the rise of Christianity, the pressure of barbarian peoples on the frontiers. Modern historians have added more: climate change, pandemic disease, political instability, the debasement of currency. No single cause explains Rome's fall. It was a system failure, multiple stresses converging on a structure that was already weakened, each one manageable alone but collectively overwhelming. People living through it did not necessarily know they were living through the fall of civilization. They were simply living their lives as best they could as things slowly got harder. The fall of Rome looked, from the inside, like a series of bad decades. Some knowledge was deliberately destroyed to maintain power. When the first Qin emperor unified China in 221 BCE, he ordered the burning of books, all historical records from other states, all philosophical texts except those of the legalist school, all books he deemed politically dangerous. The burning of books and the burying of scholars, a phrase that became synonymous with intellectual tyranny in Chinese culture, was not an accident of war or an act of religious zealotry. It was policy. The emperor understood that to control the future, you must control the past. If every record of how things had been done differently was destroyed, his way became the only way. If every philosophy that contradicted legalism was burned, legalism became truth. Knowledge is power. And those who wish to consolidate power have always understood that destroying knowledge is one way to do it. The Qin dynasty fell 15 years after its founding. But the books that were burned did not return. The people of the Indus Valley traded with Mesopotamia. Among the artifacts found at Mesopotamian sites are beads, seals, and goods that originated in the Indus Valley, 2,000 kilometers away. Among the artifacts found at Indus Valley sites are objects from the Gulf region and Mesopotamia. These two civilizations, both among the most sophisticated of the ancient world, knew each other, traded with each other, sent merchants along routes that crossed some of the most difficult terrain on Earth. We have the goods. We do not have the conversations. What did a Mesopotamian merchant think, encountering the grid-plan streets of Mohenjo-Daro? What did a Harappan trader think, walking through the markets of Ur? They must have noticed the differences. They must have had opinions. They must have described to people back home the strange and wonderful things they had seen. Those descriptions are gone. The beads remain. The conversations are lost. The last ice age ended the civilization we might have had. Between roughly 12,000 and 8,000 BC, as the last ice age ended and sea levels rose by over 100 meters worldwide, enormous areas of habitable land were drowned. The continental shelves, shallow areas now underwater, were dry land during the Ice Age. The Persian Gulf was dry. The North Sea was largely dry. A significant portion of the Indian Ocean shelf was above water. These were places where people lived. The gradual rise of the sea, probably not gradual enough to be imperceptible in a human lifetime, certainly not fast enough to be dramatic, displaced enormous populations over thousands of years. The civilizations that might have existed on those submerged lands, we have almost no trace of them. Occasionally a carved stone is found on the seafloor, suggesting habitation. But the records, the buildings, the soil with its pollen and charcoal, all of it is underwater. The oldest chapter of human civilization may be at the bottom of the sea. We lost it before we knew we had it. Every civilization believes it is at the pinnacle of human achievement. The Romans believed Roman civilization was the apex of human development. The Tang dynasty Chinese believed their culture was the highest expression of human refinement. Medieval Europeans believed Christendom was the fulfillment of human history. We believe this too. This is worth sitting with. Every civilization that has fallen believed itself permanent, or at least, the longest lasting and most advanced thing the world had ever seen. The sophistication of their achievements seemed to them self-evidently superior to what came before. And they were right, in their own terms. They had achieved things their predecessors had not. And they fell. Not because they were foolish or weak or morally inferior, but because civilizations are complex systems, and complex systems fail. Because droughts come, and empires overextend, and plagues arrive, and trade routes shift, and the particular combination of factors that sustained a civilization changes. The question is not whether civilizations fall. They do. The question is what survives them, what knowledge, what art, what ways of living carry forward. And what gets buried under the parking lot, waiting to be found. The oldest known musical instruments are over 40,000 years old. In caves in Germany and France, archaeologists have found flutes carved from vulture bone and mammoth ivory. They are the oldest known musical instruments, dating to the Upper Paleolithic period. People were making music 40,000 years ago. Not just rhythm, melody. The flutes produce a range of notes. Someone, 40 millennia before the pyramids were built, sat by a fire and played a tune. We do not know what the tune was. We do not know if it was worship or celebration or comfort or simple entertainment. We do not know if other people danced. But we know there was music. Before writing, before agriculture, before cities, there was music. The oldest thing we know about human civilization is that it involved making beautiful sounds for no practical purpose at all. The city of Jericho may be the oldest continuously inhabited city on Earth. Archaeological evidence suggests that Jericho, in the West Bank, has been inhabited for at least 11,000 years. Not as a civilization, as a settlement, growing and changing over millennia, inhabited through the rise and fall of empires and the passing of thousands of years. It has been conquered many times. Destroyed and rebuilt. Changed hands between Canaanites, Israelites, Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, Byzantines, Arabs, Crusaders, Ottomans, and others. Through all of this, people have continued to live there. This is what continuity looks like. Not unbroken culture, Jericho's culture has changed enormously over 11,000 years. Not unbroken prosperity. Not unbroken peace. Just people living in a place, generation after generation, because the spring there provides good water and the valley is fertile. The oldest city in the world is not a monument to a lost civilization. It is a demonstration of the simplest human fact: given water and soil, people stay. We have found only a fraction of what exists. Archaeologists estimate that less than 1% of all ancient sites that exist have been excavated. Most are unlocated. Many have been destroyed by modern construction, agriculture, and development before they were ever found. Every year, new surveys using LiDAR, satellite imaging, ground-penetrating radar reveal previously unknown sites, cities under jungles, settlements under deserts, harbors under the sea. Every year, sites known but unexcavated yield extraordinary finds: a new chamber in a pyramid, a buried city beneath a known ruin, a collection of tablets in a corner of a site assumed to have been fully explored. The story of human civilization that we know is a fragment of the whole. The full story, the actual record of what humans built and thought and felt and made over the 100,000 years of our existence, is mostly gone. Or mostly unfound. Or mostly unread. We are reading the surviving pages of a book almost all of which has been lost. But every year, someone finds another page. The most important thing lost civilizations tell us is that we are not special. Not in the way that stings, not you are unimportant. In the way that is actually comforting. We are not the first people to have built something beautiful and complicated and fragile. We are not the first to have believed our civilization permanent. We are not the first to have created art and knowledge and legal systems and music and love poetry that future generations would find strange and wonderful and difficult to understand. Every lost civilization was once exactly where we are, at what seemed like the peak, surrounded by the most sophisticated achievements the world had ever seen, unable to imagine that all of this could one day be ruins. And almost all of them are ruins. And yet here is the thing, here is what the ruins actually say. If you listen carefully, the people who built them were not failures. They lived. They created. They loved their cities and their children and their gods. They made things that were worth making. They solved problems that were worth solving. And then time passed, as time always does. And what they made became archaeology. And thousands of years later, someone dug it up and called it wonderful. We are not special. But we are not alone either. Behind us, stretching back into a past so deep it makes the head swim, are all the others, all the builders, all the writers, all the flute players in fire-lit caves, who were us before us. We are the latest chapter in a very long book. We will not be the last. And so we surface. From the jungle and the desert and the seafloor and the ash. From the libraries that burned and the cities that sank and the roads that led to places that are no longer there. We have walked through 11 civilizations tonight. We have stood in the grid-plan streets of a city that fell silent 4,000 years ago and left its writing locked. We have touched the stones of temples built to gods whose names are gone. We have read the oldest complaint letter in the world, written by a man who was furious about copper and is now, himself, dust. All of these places were real. All of these people were real. They woke in the morning in their cities and went about their days arguing with merchants, writing letters, watching their children grow, measuring grain with standardized weights, looking up at the stars and wondering, as we wonder, what it all means. And now they are gone, and what is left of them fits in a museum, or a jungle, or a paragraph. What does this mean for us? Perhaps it means nothing, and we should find what comfort we can in the particular moment we inhabit, the warmth of this room, the sound of breathing, the small and ordinary things that are right here, right now. Perhaps it means something larger, that the fact of being alive and building things and loving people is not made smaller by the certainty that it will end. Perhaps it is made larger. Perhaps the impermanence is the point. The Nazca drew their enormous figures in the desert, visible only from a sky they could never reach, for reasons we still debate. The builders of Göbekli Tepe carved their stone pillars with images of animals, then buried them carefully, and walked away. The last person to speak a language looked at the world one final time in the only way they had words for, and then closed their eyes. All of this happened. All of it was real. Now let it go. Let the ruins settle back into the earth from which they came. Let the stars that guided the ancient astronomers continue their slow rotation overhead. Let your breathing slow, and your thoughts soften, and the long procession of the human story move past you like a river in the dark, vast, and ancient, and going somewhere none of us can see. You are part of it. You always were. Sleep well. The past keeps its watch.